1 week season.
Hey, welcome in, OWS fam. So glad you're back with us. We're back here in the DFS lab. As always, this show presented by 1 week season, where we look at the upcoming slate by building a DraftKings lineup. In this case, we're looking at Showdown tonight, as it is Monday morning, December 9th, around 9 a.m. Eastern, when we are recording this. And tonight, you got the Cowboys hosting the Bengals, with the Bengals installed as 5.5-point road favorites. And I'm your host, Cheeseman, and I am now privileged to welcome up Xandamere. And Xandamere, and how's it going? I know you were doing a little vacay last week. Certainly missed you on the slate. Hilo and Mike Johnson, though, did a great job, but of course missed you. And then what did you think, man, of just an insane week 14?
Yeah, well, it's good to be back. Missed doing the show with you last week as well.
Yes.
Always have fun doing these, and it's good to get back into the swing of things. I made the, catastrophic scheduling mistake of scheduling a vacation that overlapped not one but two Sundays, which was just a terrible, terrible idea. But it was an interesting week. It was one of the highest scoring weeks fantasy-wise that I can recall. I mean, what the Millie Maker was won by something like a 280 or 270 or something like that on DraftKings. And, scores in the mid to high 200s. And the optimal was around 300 points or something ridiculous like that. So, it's a high scoring week because we had a lot of really outlier outcomes. I mean, Josh Allen in the 50s, obviously, but also a lot of fairly owned players scored a lot of points, right? Because sometimes if it's like if a guy scores 40 points and no one plays him, does it make a sound? Like is it tree falls in the forest, blah blah. But but the guys that scored a lot of points, they weren't chalk mostly, except for the running backs. But like Josh Allen was owned. Puka Nacua had some ownership. Justin Jefferson was obviously chalky. Jordan Addison had some ownership. So like a lot of the guys that really smashed, they did have some ownership. So it led to these massive, massive scores. Mildly annoying because I still did the research into the slate because I was still creating content for it. And my sort of summary in the Oracle that we do was basically the running back player pool is extremely small. Like you really could just play the 5 running backs that are like the top projected ones, which were Saquon, Alvin Kamara at the higher end, and then Isaac Guerendo, Brandon Allen, and Zach Charbonnet at the lower end. And it was clear that Saquon, Charbonnet, and Guerendo they were a tier above the other two of Allen and Kamara, and so really it was like 3 main running backs and a sprinkle of a couple others. And so those guys were all owned, right? But like you can still go overweight highly owned plays. And so just limiting your running back player pool to those 5 and really mainly to those 3 would have given you a leg up. And then, we talked about like what games to attack. And my perspective was there's a lot that are attractive and you can make case for almost anything. And so what makes sense to me is just, once you have a very narrow running back player pool, that means that you can sort of expand your player pool at quarterback and just build game stacks, like a little bit of everything kind of, or a little bit of most things. And so, because you still have the same overall player pool size, right? Normally I'm like a 6-7 quarterback and like 6 to 8 running backs. But if you do 3 running backs primarily with 5 total, then you could go 10 quarterbacks or something like that. You have the same number of total players in the player pool.
Yeah.
So you can sort of switch around how you're allocating your risk basically and saying I'm putting, more running backs, fewer quarterbacks, or vice versa. In this case, it's vice versa for this week. And so then you end up with a bunch of different game stacks targeting a bunch of different games, and you would have landed on, the Vikings were obviously chalky. That wasn't a surprise. But you would have landed on some Bills. You would have landed on multiple good spots. And then you just have to hope the pieces come together, right? But like I also noted that the wide receiver chalk was very bad, except it felt exceptionally fragile to me. There's a lot of plays that were like median plays, floor plays, not so much ceiling plays. We've seen this a lot. And give me just 1 second. Actually, I'm just going to pull up our ownership for the wide receivers because there were a lot that just seemed really shaky to me.
Yeah, well, I'm trying to remember some of the top owned receivers. I know some of the Titans receivers were getting some ownership.
Calvin Ridley mainly. So I've got it. Let's see. It's like Juwan Jennings was like fine. He's from an ownership perspective, he was fine. Except and he had a pretty decent game, right? It's not like he had a bad game. He was the one I thought was the best of the chalk. But then like Jacoby Myers is a guy like I'm never interested in playing Raiders pass catchers generally. Drake London, like great floor, ceiling, nah. Jerry Jeudy had a lot of ownership coming off of one good game. And but I wasn't super interested in playing guys against the Pittsburgh pass defense. Mike Evans is fine, but wide receivers against the Raiders has not exactly been a super prolific spot. And his role has not really been that much bigger without Godwin. Calvin Ridley, Titans receivers, there were just a lot of wide receivers I thought were really in really, really fragile spots. And so if you just took the basic strategy of spread out your quarterback exposures to stack a bunch of different games, have that really narrow running back player pool, and then dodge these really high-end wide receivers, you would have ended up, just by necessity, you would have ended up with some good lineups. And, that's not to say that, I'm not saying, I would have smashed every GPP, because it's hard to win tournaments. You still have to get everything to come together just right. But I think that, just following that basic strategy would have been in a good spot to hopefully find something that the right combination that bubbles up. And, it's hard to find the exact right combo. Would have been nice to land on George Kittle, obviously the highest scoring tight end. I personally probably wouldn't have landed there, because I don't think I would have gotten there with Garendo. If I did, it would have been a Brock Purdy lineup, and that would have made it. So you're never going to land on the exact optimal thing, but I think that it would have been a fun week to play. I will do better at my vacation scheduling in the future. But overall, though, I think, what I like to look at is, is our overall strategy that we've landed on at OWS. And obviously we have different content producers. So it's not like there's one OWS strategy, right? You're going to get different perspectives. And I like that about OWS. We don't necessarily have this is our consensus, because consensus is bland and consensus tends to lead you to mediocrity. I like that we have people who say this is how we're approaching it. We're going to take stands and be different from each other even. But I think overall, what OWS was talking about this week feels like it was strong. Again, you look at the game stat questions and go look at JM's answer. First guy he has on the list, Josh Allen naked. Second line, Josh Allen the pass catcher. Right? There's just Mike Johnson favorite, Josh Allen with Amari Cooper and Puka bring back. So I think we were on the overall strategy of narrow running backs, expand player pools at quarterback, dodge the poor wide receiver chalk. Overall, we were on that strategy, and I think it worked out pretty well. We had a pretty good week, I think, for our users. We had somebody take down the slant. I think we didn't have a lot of huge ones, but we had a lot of high scoring rosters across our customer base that we saw get posted. They saw get posted in our Bigs channel. I think we had, a bunch of over 200 scores. Some guy had a really good Millie sweat that didn't quite pan out, but a good week. So that's what I like to see too, is just, I see the results in our content. And I think do I think that our content was sharp and on point? And then I see the results in how did our customers do? How did our users do? Did it feel like, they, in aggregate, they had a pretty solid week? I think so. So that's a win for me.
Yeah, absolutely, man. I couldn't agree more. It was a lighter week for me, just busyness, with work. Just didn't have time to really dig into the research as much as I would have liked. But yeah, the content of 1 week season was sharp, and just looking at those games like the Rams and the Bills, or the Vikings, and like you said, the Vikings were chalky. But just who could have predicted close to 100 points scored between the Bills and the Rams? But when you have those games where you have players like the Rams receivers or like Josh Allen, players that are explosive and are talented, that can just, put a game into that kind of phase where the teams are just we don't care about making sure we're run pass balanced anymore. We are just trying to score as many points as fast as we can, because defense just isn't here today, those type of games can develop. And so, I love that 1 week season was on that,
Yeah. And it was, I think a lot about it's funny. I didn't think about this as much in football DFS originally until I didn't think about it as much until I started playing NBA DFS. But a lot of success in this game, in this contest, is about winning the position. And so if you listen to listen to Hilo and I talk on the slate, we talk a lot about who are guys who can put the slate away at their position. Who are guys who can generate scores that put the slate sort of out of reach. And really at quarterback, there was really only one guy this week, is Josh Allen. You could argue Jalen Hurts has the same ceiling, and he does, but in a matchup against Carolina, like, is it possible that Carolina puts up enough of a fight that that Jalen Hurts generates a ceiling? It's possible, but it's much less likely.
Yeah.
But like, so really it was like Josh Allen stood kind of head and shoulders above the rest of the quarterbacks to me, as a guy who, if he hits, he can really put the slate away. He really has the ceiling to, nuke every other quarterback, and he did, right? And of course, it doesn't always play out that way, right? Like at tight end, you could argue with a couple guys who had to put the slate out of reach ceiling were Brock Bowers and Trey McBride, and George Kittle. And George Kittle did, right? Like, but it would have been hard to get to him because it would have been hard to get to him with Garendo, without Purdy. And Brock Bowers and Trey McBride obviously failed. So it's not just because if you play for that ceiling strategy, it's not always going to hit, right? Like, not everyone always hits the ceiling, but like, it shocked me to see Josh Allen projected to be so low owned when he was clearly the highest floor, highest ceiling quarterback on the slate. And he's the only quarterback who really had a like nuke the slate, you can't win without him kind of ceiling. And we had really strong value at running back, which enabled you to pay up for him fairly easily. And I think it's hard to stack the Bills. That's why, right? Like, it's hard to stack. People want to stack him. And it's like, well, who do you stack Josh Allen with? Khalil Shakir, sure, he's a slot receiver. Ceiling is sometimes questionable there. He hit it, right? But even his ceiling wasn't like awesome. It was like 24 points or something like that. It was good, but not elite. Amari Cooper, like, well, how integrated is he with the offense? And it's like, who do you stack Josh Allen with is the hard thing. I think that's what kind of kept people away from him to some extent. But I don't know. Like, he was such a strong play, and he smashed. Yeah. And so,
he did.
And Josh Allen's always been a favorite of OWS, right? Like, OWS has been fans of Josh Allen since he was like, since people thought he sucked, right? Like back when he was like early in his career, and the Bills were terrible, but Josh Allen would just run all over the place, throw terrible passes all over the place, but just chuck it all over the yard, and throw interceptions every game. But like, he's fun, but back when he wasn't like a good quarterback that was good at winning NFL games, but he was still good at generating DFS scores.
Yeah, absolutely, man. I took a page out of your playbook on yesterday because I was like entering contests late, and I knew I didn't have time for research, so I just kind of decided to kind of like gather what I had and then enter some smaller field contests like 30 minutes before lock. And so I got into one contest that had like 39 entrants, and ended up cashing in that one. But it's just like the scores at the top are so much lower. It's just like, I remember you said recently on the show, my best ever plus EV contests are contests with like 5 players in it. So I kind of try to take that to heart a little bit. And so it's just like when you're in contests like that, you're kind of able to, I think there was only like 1 or 2 people who had Josh Allen in that contest, but there was the lineup that took first place in that contest had Josh Allen, Puka Nacua, like 100 points between the two. The rest of their lineup was like nothing special. And then like, I think like on DraftKings, in the app, you see the snowflake or the fire. So like a snowflaked defense, and then nothing special outside of that. I don't think they even had Charbonneau, and they still won the tournament. It was like a 39-person contest, and they got first for like 500 or something like that. It just was crazy.
Yeah, I mean, you don't need perfection when you're competing against fewer players. And what I tend to think it's about is, like, people tend to play very, very like cash-focused lineups, and there's so much overlap. And so, like, one sort of fun exercise to do is go look at ownership in like a very small contest compared to ownership in say the Millie Maker. So like Charbonnet was 40% in the Millie Maker, right? And so was Garendo-ish, right around there. And so I would bet money that they were at least 60% in the contest that you played in.
Yep.
Probably closer to 70, 80.
Charbonnet was 60, I think, in that contest.
Yeah. And so the point is that, like, and obviously he had a great game, right? And so I'm not saying you should have faded Charbonnet and mentioned the winner did. The point is more that, like, the chalk gets chalkier, and so you only have to make a little bit of a pivot. Because so many people are playing these like cash-focused lineups that there's so much overlap between them. And this is especially true in like 3-man, 5-man, 10-man kind of contests. There's so much overlap. Like, you'll often just see straight up duplicate lineups in like 5-man contests. Like I've had 5-man contests where 4 players around the same lineup. And so, yeah, like it's a good lineup. It's going to project well. But like, if I'm the only one with a different lineup, then, those four players have even if it's the best lineup in the world, those four players have maybe a 53% chance to split first place four ways, whereas I have a 47% chance to win it outright, and win, 3.5x my entry or whatever first place ends up being, right? 3.5, 4x my entry, something like that. And so like it's clearly plus EV to play in those contests with a not cash focused strategy. You're just trying to say, I won't win this every week, but if I win it every third week, if I win these kinds of contests every third week, I'm going to make a lot of money in them over time.
Absolutely. Cool, man. Well, hey, we've spent a lot of time talking at strategy from yesterday. Let's jump into the showdown now, and we got an entertaining matchup here tonight. The Bengals, great in terms of offense, a great offensive team, not as great in terms of the defensive side, but obviously Dallas is Dallas. Cooper Rush, who hasn't done awful at quarterback. They have some players. So how do you look at this game? Obviously, Dallas is at home. Cincinnati is favored. And so is this a game where you're looking at, well, I'll just let you take it from here. How do you look to attack this game?
Yeah, so the total, when I wrote the article for this, was like around 48 or 49. I don't remember. With Bengals roughly 5.5 point favorites. And so the implied team total for Dallas at the time was about 22 points. And so that kind of at first glance like feels a little high because you're like Dallas backup quarterback, Cooper Rush. But then you go look into it and you realize, so Cooper Rush has started 5 games for the Cowboys this season. And they scored 21 against Atlanta, 27 against the Giants, 34 against the Commanders, and then 10 against the Texans and 6 against the Eagles. So 20 plus points in 3 of Rush's 5 starts. The Bengals are allowing 28.3 points per game, which is second most in the NFL, tied with the Jaguars, who we know are terrible. Behind only the Panthers. So the Bengals defense has been real, real bad. It's like, okay, I can see that. I can see why the total is the way it is. But then you go look at like the Bengals defense and look at who they've played. And so like they've played a lot of really good offenses. They played the Ravens twice. They played the Eagles. They played the Chargers. They played, they played the Commanders.
Kansas City Commanders, yeah.
Well, Kansas City's a mid-tier offense, but yeah,
that's true. Forget that.
But and it's like, and they've still given up points to some mediocre offenses. They gave 24 to the Panthers. They gave up, 38 to the Steelers, who've actually been pretty good under Russell Wilson. So like, the point is, like, I think the Bengals defense is not as bad as the points allowed looks because they've faced a pretty tough schedule. It doesn't mean they're good. It doesn't mean they're like awesome all of a sudden, but they faced a pretty tough schedule. I think we need to take that into account.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a couple ways you can build for this. So there's 2 main ways I'm going to be approaching this. One way is I'm going to be building a bunch of Bengals onslaughts. And that story is basically saying the Bengals defense is not as bad as they've looked. They've played a really tough schedule, and the Cowboys offense with Cooper Rush is just not good. We have a more than 1 year sample on Cooper Rush as a quarterback. He's not a good quarterback. He's heartily below average. And so, we think the Bengals are going to be able to sort of pin their ears back and just dominate the game start to finish. The second path is saying, it's sort of the classic like 4-2 underdog construction for Showdown, which I love using because people don't like playing underdogs, but underdogs are competitive at high rates. And the 4-2 underdog construction is actually pretty attractive in this particular Showdown because so much of the Bengals fantasy production is concentrated in their top 4 guys, in Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, and Chase Brown. Right, like that. So much of their fantasy output is concentrated in those 4 guys that a 4-2 underdog construction makes a lot of sense because what you're hoping there is saying, okay, it's really only 2 Bengals that get there out of the 4 big ones. And then the Cowboys don't have to win the game for this to work, right? The production has to be spread out more, right? And so if you say only 2 of the 4 big Bengals, then you're just saying that the rest of the offense is spread out more across them. And multiple Cowboys get there. Well, it's like the Bengals, it's Jamar Chase has 40 points and Joe Burrow has 28 points, but no one else has more than 10, right? Which is entirely plausible given how concentrated the Bengals offense is. So those are the 2 main angles I'm taking. it's worth noting that like if you just go sort of blindly run an optimizer, you're going to get a lot of four of the four top Bengals. You're going to get a lot of lineups with all four, and you're going to get almost every lineup you build, almost every lineup you run is going to have at least three of the four top Bengals, just because of how well they project and because of how concentrated the offense is, higher team total. You're just going to see a lot of lineups that look like that. And that's okay, right? That's okay. But it just means that if that's the direction you're going, you've got to think about how to be different. If you're going the Bengals heavy route, just recognize that the field is going to be, even if they're not like intentionally thinking it, even if they're just kind of blindly running optimizers, they're going to get to a lot of Bengals heavy lineups. And so if that's the direction you're going, that's fine. Just recognize that you need to think about how you're going to be different in that build. And one way to be different, because people don't play 5-1 Onslaught builds at the rate they probably should. And so one way to be different in Bengals heavy builds is to build for the Onslaught. And so my thought here is if you want at least three of the big four Bengals, just run 5 Bengals in that scenario. Because that's one way to say, like, in those Bengals heavy scenarios, this is how I can run the Bengals heavy scenario and be different. Another way to do it, like, it's not the only way. Another way to do it would say, if I'm running lineups with at least 3 of the big 4 Bengals, I want to leave at least 2K salary on the table. And so you could do that in an optimizer, right?
Love
like
that, man. Love that.
The way you do that, and I've talked about this in other ways of how I run optimizers, is you can't set up a rule that does that because optimizers don't really have rules involving salary left on the table. But what you could do is you could say, if I'm running 150 lineups, I'm going to put 50 lineups as that fall into this bucket, and I'm going to run a set of 50, and I'm going to say I have a rule that says at least 3 of Joe Burrow, T. Higgins, Jamar Chase, and Chase Brown, and a max salary of leaving 2K on the table. So that's how I would do that.
Yes.
And I'd run 50 lineups like that, or 40 lineups like that, or however many I want to do. And that would be my, this is my big 3 Bengals with salary on the table construction. And so again, it's okay to play into the way that ownership is going to go, right? Like ownership is going to be heavy on the big 4 Bengals, and it should be. It's correct, right? They're the best plays in the game. You just have to think about I'm going to play into ownership, and I'm going to find a way to do it differently. Or you think about I'm not going to play into ownership. I'm going to play away from ownership, and that would be the max 2 the big 4 Bengals, a more Cowboys heavy build. So you can think about where you're going to play into ownership, where you're not going to play into ownership. Like in Showdown, you're going to have to play some chalk because there's only one game where the player's available to play. And you just have it becomes more about thinking, not about thinking how do I fade the chalk, and more about thinking how do I play it in ways that are different than most of the field's going to play it. Yeah. So for this build, that's my broad thought. So for this build, we're going to go to the Bengals Onslaught route. So if I remember right, I'm trying to remember our content from a few weeks before. If I remember right, the last time I had this this sort of same scenario, I ended up building the 4-2 underdog construction. And so I'll have lots of that tonight too. But for now, for this one, I'm going to build the Bengals Onslaught. And so a couple of Onslaught principles before we get into this. Now, Onslaught principle number 1. When a 5-1 Onslaught wins, the 2 most likely captains are the running back and the quarterback by a fairly wide margin. It's not unheard of, but it's unusual for a pass catcher to be the optimal captain in an Onslaught build because when teams score a lot of points and the other team doesn't score many points, they tend to stop passing later in the game. Right? They tend to stop passing as much later in the game. 2, when a team scores a lot of points, it's usually more spread out, which means it's less likely for a pass catcher to beat the quarterback, right? Usually when a pass catcher is the optimal captain, especially an expensive pass catcher, that means they have to beat the quarterback in raw score. And so for that to happen, you usually need a very concentrated scoring environment. Sorry, 1 second. Sorry, I just need a drink of water. I think I'm worried I'm coming down with something after my trip to Disneyland, where many plague-infested children frolic. Anyway,
man, absolutely.
So that's principle number 1 of Onslaughts, is that the most likely captain is the quarterback or the running back. Principle number 2 of Onslaughts is that the defense, if an Onslaught build is successful, if a 5-1 build is the optimal, the defense is roughly 40 to 50% odds to appear in that optimal lineup, because it makes sense because the other team doesn't score. If the other team doesn't score, your defense is likely doing well. Number 3 is their third principle is the most likely bring back from the other side is a pass catcher or the RB1. And a pass catcher because, right, like it's unlikely to be the quarterback because quarterbacks need touchdowns in order to generate fantasy points, or a lot of rushing. And Cooper Rush, despite the name, doesn't actually run. So it's probably a pass catcher. It could be the running back, especially if it's a pass catching running back that has a reasonable likelihood of success. And Dowdle is a pass catching running back, so Rico Dowdle's a viable choice here. But it's most likely going to be either Rico Dowdle or one of the Dallas pass catchers as the bring back in a 5-1 construction. So with those sort of principles in mind, let's go build a roster.
Let's do it, man.
So I'm going to start with Chase Brown at captain because, and like my favorite captain in Onslaught builds is the running back because you can count on him going deep into games and running deep into games. Chase Brown, in the last 4 Bengals games, since Chase Brown took over as the lead running back after Zach Moss got hurt, Chase Brown has all but 1 running back touch in the last 4 games.
Wow.
Like, seriously. Yeah. Which is, I mean, talk about like an insane, this guy's the best role in the NFL.
Where do I sign up? Yeah.
Right now. And like, yeah, that's probably not going to continue from now to the end of the season, right? Like they've got Khalil Herbert, like they're not going to give him every single touch forever. That's insane. But it's not going to go to like a 50-50 split either. Or it's highly unlikely, right? Like we might see Khalil Herbert get a couple more carries in this game. I would note if you're building Onslaught builds and you're not playing Chase Brown, Khalil Herbert makes a really, really interesting low-owned play because what you're saying there, you're saying this, if Chase Brown doesn't get there, then what you could see happening is the Bengals get up early through passing. They're up big, and then they just decide, okay, Chase Brown's gotten a lot of work the last few weeks. Let's give him a rest. And they give Khalil Herbert more work at the end of the game when they're up 3 scores.
Yeah.
So anyway,
I mean, can you play Chase Brown and Herbert? Is there a scenario where you can play both and just hope that Brown gets a pair of touchdowns early and then Herbert kind of cleans up later?
Yeah, you can. I mean, keep in mind, like I would only play that in an Onslaught build, and the reason why is in an Onslaught build, you're already building off the hypothesis that half the players that are available on the slate effectively do nothing. Right. Like, and so in that scenario, when you're taking the entire Dallas side of the slate and saying these guys all suck except for one guy, you're cutting the player pool in half. And so you're effectively saying is I don't need as big of scores from the other half of the player pool now in order to be optimal. Like if Dallas doesn't do anything, then it's more likely that 9 points from Khalil Herbert is optimal. Yep. If Dallas fights back, it's less likely that 9 points from Khalil Herbert is optimal. Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, you can definitely play them together in a showdown lineup.
Got it.
Sorry, in an onslaught.
Yeah. Right. Cool, dude.
Okay, so we got Brown. I know that I already know that we're gonna go for the at least 3 of the big Bengals because they project the best because we're betting that Dallas doesn't score points. So who does, right? So the Bengals are a very concentrated offense. So we know we're gonna go with at least 3. I also know that if I go all 4 and it's a lineup where I have one of the big Bengals as the captain, my salary constraints are very, very tight at the lower end. I've got 30, I did this earlier, 3,700, I think, if I start with Joe Burrow captain. If it's Chase Brown, I got 4K left for the last 2 spots. So you end up with a really, really, really tight salary constraint if you go all 4 big Bengals. So I'm going to go 3 in this one. And the other 2 I'm going to put in are Burrow and T. Higgins. And so Burrow, because the quarterback is something like 80 to 90% likely to show up in Onslaught builds, and Onslaught optimals, because so much of the production flows through them and because the other team, we're betting the other team does nothing. And then T. Higgins is sort of an interesting choice. And the reason I picked him is you might not realize this, but or at least I wouldn't have realized this if I hadn't paid attention to it because of my sort of preseason, bias or how I thought about the Bengals pass catchers. In games that they've played together this year, T. Higgins has 10 more targets than Ja'Marr Chase total. So T. Higgins
would not have guessed that either. Yeah.
In the games they played together, T. Higgins has 68 targets and Ja'Marr Chase has 58 targets. Now, Ja'Marr Chase can do on a per target basis is slightly more productive. He averages more yards per reception. And so this is not a knock on Ja'Marr Chase, right? Like Ja'Marr Chase is awesome. The thing is, it's more that T. Higgins is also awesome. And T. Higgins has seen more targets, more overall fantasy points in games they played together. And so it's more not like, I think Jamar Chase is still a great play. This is more me saying that, like, when there's a 2K salary difference between them, I'm going to lean a little more to Higgins because they're actually pretty similar plays. As much as we are enamored with Jamar Chase, and as much as I love Jamar Chase, I think he's an elite player, and he is. T. Higgins is almost as good. They're very, very close.
Yeah.
So now we're down to this 5K range. Now there's a couple different ways we can go. I'm going to start by plugging in the Bengals defense because I really like playing the Bengals defense in Bengals onslaughts because I think that people's perception of the Bengals defense is they are so terrible that, like, they're just not going to play them. And so I think they're going to be a very, very low owned defense. And so I really want to play them in onslaught builds, both because A, we know that defense shows up in onslaught optimals very high rate, very high frequency, and B, I think that Bengals defense as a whole is likely to be under owned here. Keep in mind that, like, defenses generally get there on a defensive touchdown, right? Like, you get a sack, a strip sack fumble, or a pick and a touchdown, and your defense is already well on its way to being optimal. And those are wildly unpredictable things, right? So, like, my general rule of defense in Showdown is I will always try to be overweight the low-owned defenses and underweight the high-owned defenses because it's the most volatile position. I just want to, I want to capture the upside of the super rare, defensive touchdown outcomes. And I want to capture this at low ownership when possible. So Bengals defense, and now I've got 5,700, and so there's a couple ways you can go. So the two ways that I think are the most interesting from this start are there's three ways. There's three Dallas players I think that fit best from where we are. One is if you're willing to punt the last position entirely, you can go CeeDee Lamb. That's a thin punt play. Like, you're playing probably Jermaine Burton as your last in Bengal, right? Because you got 900 left, and he's about the only guy you can play. You can't even play Khalil Herbert, I don't think.
Yep. No, you're a 1500 short of Herbert.
Yeah. So CeeDee Lamb, and so I'll probably have a lineup that looks like that. Rico Dowdle gets you a little bit more salary flexibility, so then you can still play the Burton punt. But you could also then play Tanner Hudson, who is a reasonably good pass catching tight end. Drew Sample, who's a blocking tight end, but you hope he catches, hope he lucks into a touchdown. So the lineup with Dowdle and Tanner Hudson, I think, is pretty strong. I'm going to go for a slightly more higher floor, more basic lineup for the one we're actually kind of doing as our lineup here, and that's going to be Cade York, the Bengals kicker. Kickers often show up in Showdown and tournament optimals or in onslaught optimals because, again, you're counting on one, the Bengals were successfully driving the field multiple times, and two, the Dallas not scoring. So, again, you get a spot where, like, 9 points from a kicker is optimal. As Dallas doesn't score, kickers are high floor plays. You don't need the 5 field goal outcome in an onslaught for the kicker to be optimal, right? You need 2 field goals and a couple extra points, and then you're in double digit range.
Yeah.
And then you're sitting pretty with a double digit kicker if Dallas doesn't score at all. And then Ferguson, I think, is he's coming back from an injury, but it was a concussion. And those tend to be sort of all or nothing, right? It's not like he has to work his way back. It tend to be like when you come back, you're a full go. And Ferguson has, a couple games of high targets with Cooper Rush, right? Cooper Rush does not throw deep. So Ferguson and Lamb are likely to be his preferred targets. So I think his target volume is quite high for someone at 5,400. I think his projectable target volume, like he should be. He's actually the cheapest he's been in a Showdown all season. He should be, even with a backup quarterback, he should probably be more like the 6K range, the low 6s. So I think that he's going to be a full go. He's got a great matchup. I think that he's probably my favorite mid-range Dallas play. So yeah, that's awesome. I'm running out of things to say about Jake Ferguson.
No, I love it, dude. So this is the lineup we landed on. You have Chase Brown at the captain, Bengals onslaught build, which I mean, if I had to go a direction tonight, I think this is the one I'd want to go with Chase Brown at the captain, and then Burrow, Higgins, Bengals, Cade York, and Jake Ferguson. And that's it, dude. So for the pod, you just heard the lineup. Xandamere, awesome stuff as always. Are you gonna try and play this tonight? I know you got props. I know you got NBA tonight. So obviously a full fantasy, lots of stuff going on. We love it. But you think you'll play this one tonight?
I will. So the NBA is actually on this really weird scheduling week where the in-season tournament, the Emirates Cup as they call it this year.
Oh right. I should have looked.
It's in the it's reached the bracket stage instead of the sort of group play stage, and so like I think that's why they left the schedule kind of open this week. And it's like we only have one game tonight. We have 2 games tomorrow because they're only playing the teams that are like in the cup standings. So there's a really light NBA schedule this week, and because of that, I get to have a little bit lighter NBA time, which means I get more time for showdown stuff, which is cool.
Let's go, man. Bengals, Cowboys tonight. I hope you enjoy the game, and I hope you're able to hit something. Xandamere, as always, man, thanks for the time. Stuff is always so valuable, and I appreciate it. I learn a lot as well. So, yeah, man, appreciate the time, and we'll talk to you next week.
Love it. Have good luck tonight if you play as well, and I'll see you soon.
All right, see you soon.